Without a doubt, John has saved the greatest sign for last. In a tiny place called Bethany, the reality of death is going to be confronted with the author of life. We're about to see a side of Jesus we've never seen before. Welcome to 30 on Thursdays, the online resource of the Root Church of Tampa Bay at University Mall. Pastor David here with you, and in this week's episode, we're looking at the final sign that Jesus works in the Book of Signs portion of John's Gospel. I told you when we started this series weeks ago that some people break down the Gospel of John into 2 parts, maybe even 4 parts. But basically, chapters 1 through 12, where Jesus works all the signs in his earthly ministry, and then chapters 13 through the end of the Gospel that talk about the final night, the final weekend, and the last words of Jesus, okay? I don't like that, and you'll see why as we, at the very, very, very end of this week's episode, I'm going to tell you why I don't like that, okay? Now, signs, as we've defined them throughout the entirety of this series, is that they're miracles with a message. They point to something beyond themselves. In this case, they're pointing to Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, you may have noticed that these signs have gotten longer as we've kind of progressed through John's Gospel. It's true. You're right on. John chapter 9, for example, required all 41 verses of that chapter to tell us about Jesus healing the man who had been born blind. In this week's episode, we're going to be in John chapter 11, 44 verses of this chapter, and arguably even more, are required to tell us what Jesus does in this week's miracle, in this week's sign. Now, what happens in John chapter 10? I don't want you to be lost here. You've got to have some context here. So as we jump from John chapter 9 last week to John chapter 11 this week, just you got to bear in mind some crucial things that happened in John 10. Namely, he did teaching. There are several key verses in John chapter 10. Let me just draw your attention to a few of them. Number one is John 10:10. In John 10:10, Jesus issues a clear, just point-blank teaching about who he is and who the devil, our enemy, is. Do your soul a favor, please. Memorize John 10:10, because it will guide you and it will give you hope and confidence in some of the darkest moments of your life. John 10:10. Dude, memorize it or get the tattoo on your arm. Either which way, put it close to your heart, okay? Secondly, Jesus records not 1 but 2 I am statements, okay? So again, I am statements are the statements that Jesus makes in John's Gospel and only in John's Gospel. Sorry, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John's Gospel, he makes these, he records these I am statements of Jesus, where Jesus says, in John 10, for example, he says, I am the door of the sheep, or I'm the gate of the sheep, and I am the good shepherd. It's Jesus' way of equating himself with God. He's the I am statements where he's basically saying, I am God. And in John 10, he utters not 1, but 2. And then thirdly and finally, at the ending of John's chapter 10, Jesus makes an inflammatory statement that just riles up the Jews to the point where they pick up stones to kill him again. He says, I and the Father are one. Okay? So that's what you may have missed out on or forgot about from John chapter 10. And as we step into John chapter 11, I can't stress to you how massive this sign is. Without a doubt, it trumps all the others combined in the past, okay? But in spite of how big this is, in spite of how magnificent this miracle, this sign is, let me just fast forward to John chapter 12 after this event takes place and read to you what John says is the result of this miracle that we're about to see and all the other miracles that Jesus has worked. John chapter 12, verse 37. Though he, Jesus, had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him. Which is interesting based on what you're about to see in this week's episode. But don't be surprised. In John chapter 10, there's another teaching that Jesus, I'm going to go back to John 10 for a second. Before he does what he's about to do in John chapter 11, this is what he says to his detractors, to his dissenters. He says, if I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. In other words, Jesus is saying, look, you may have some difficulty, some trouble believing what I'm teaching about me and about my Father and about heaven and about eternal life. Fine. But don't not believe in me because of what I'm saying or because of what you think I'm saying. Believe in me because of what you see me doing. Believe in me because of what you see coming out of my life, okay? And so the fact that these people, these Jewish leaders, see what they're about to see take place in John chapter 11 and they don't believe, it says much more about their hard hearts than about Jesus' identity. Let's jump into John chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, and see what all the ruckus is about. John chapter 11, verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Okay, let's just pause and talk about Lazarus for a second, because we know a number of things about him just based on these first 6 verses. Number one, we know that he's a guy who has 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, okay? We also know that he lives in this town called Bethany, which is only about 1.5 miles, 2 miles tops from Jerusalem, which is where we last left Jesus in John chapter 10. Keep that in mind, okay? We also know that he's sick, he's ill. Twice, in fact, in these 6 verses, John tells us that he gives the report that the prognosis is the brother is ill. He ain't doing good, okay? And we're told that Jesus has an affinity for this man, that Jesus loves this man. Not once, but again twice in these 6 short verses. John tells us Jesus loved Lazarus. And he does. Jesus loved Mary and Martha too. Jesus loved Lazarus, okay? Now, we're not told this. We're not told this in the story, but if you look it up, you do the research, you actually find out that Lazarus' name, as every other name in the Bible, it means something. Lazarus' name means God is my help. You're going to see just how ironic and how true that is as we progress through the story. Now, Jesus talks about the glory of God here. Once again, he connects physical impairment, physical suffering, okay, to the glory of God. He says, listen, this illness is not going to lead to death. It's going to be for God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it, right? He did a very similar thing in John chapter 9 when he talked about the blind man. Hey, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus goes, look, it's for the glory, it's that the works of God might be displayed in his life that this man was born blind, okay? And so this last phrase we'll look at here is Jesus, it says, John says he stayed 2 more days, okay? This is such a curious line. Let me read it to you again with some inflection. Verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he got on a pony. He rented a camel. He started running to Bethany. No. He loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. That makes no sense. Why does he stay? I mean, is he just too busy to help Lazarus? Does he disagree with the prognosis, with the diagnosis of Lazarus' sickness? I mean, what's going on here, right? Okay, we'll kind of isolate that as we move forward. Okay, I want to kind of fast forward through the story and tell you what happens in John chapter 11, verses 7 through 16. Okay, there's this distance issue because it comes into key. Like, if Jesus is in Jerusalem, it's a 15, 20-minute jog tops to get to Bethany. Not 2 days, okay? So what's going on there? But John chapter 11, verse 7 kind of makes it sound as though Jesus and his posse have rolled out of Jerusalem, maybe even out of Judea as a whole. You have to read verse 7 there. So we don't know exactly, but just keep that in mind. More importantly, Jesus issues some more teaching about darkness and light, this ongoing theme in John's gospel. He references the night and the day specifically. And then in John chapter 11, verse 14, Jesus outright says, because there's some confusion, he goes, look, Lazarus has died, okay? And so, which is interesting that Jesus would even know that, because he's not in Bethany. But then again, he is God. So he says, Lazarus has died, guys. And then he says this line in 11:15, and for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Let's continue the story. John chapter 11, verse 17. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give it to you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." But Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" And she said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." Okay, so again, let's just pause for a second. Jesus returns to Bethany in Judea. He gets to Bethany, he gets to this house, he gets to this little small village there on the southeast corner of the Mount of Olives, kind of where Jerusalem is located, right? I mean, again, these two towns, a city and a town, they're very close to each other. And he finds that Lazarus' body has been in the tomb for 4 days. Okay, so we've already told that he waited 2 days, so where's those other 2 days coming in? Is that the travel time? I mean, again, we don't know, it doesn't matter. Lazarus' body has been in a grave for 4 days. He's been dead at least for 4 days. Okay, Jews would have, I mean, I can't even imagine the circumstance that would have prevented this. When a Jewish person died in Jesus' day, they put the body in the tomb that same day. Okay, now, Jews believed in Jesus' day, there was some people who were superstitious who believed that the spirit of a dead person hovered around a body for 3 days, kind of above it or near it, maybe in the hopes that it might actually re-enter into the body and the person would come back alive. Okay, now again, don't knock them for their superstition. There are superstitions that are at play even in our day, right? Okay, but keep that in mind. Not 3 days have passed. 4 days this cat has been in the tomb, okay? So then Martha walks up to Jesus and greets him and says these words, quote, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Okay, I need your help on this. For years I have wondered exactly what Martha has intended in this. If I said Mary a second ago, I meant to say Martha. For years I've wondered what Martha has intended by this statement. Is she accusing Jesus? You know, is she blaming Jesus? Is she fishing for some answer? Is she asking a question in a statement? You know, is she fishing for something? What does Martha mean by the statement, quote, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died"? I mean, is it just as simple as face value, or is there something else? Please do me a favor. Put your answer to that question in the comment section below. I would be greatly appreciative for any help that you can offer. Again, what does Martha mean by this statement in verse 21? Okay, regardless of the answer, regardless of the meaning, Jesus gives this answer to Martha. He says one of his most powerful, one of his greatest I am statements in the Gospel of John. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And," watch this, "everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Okay, this line is so powerful. Jesus says resurrection is possible. There is life after death, okay? Resurrection is possible, but it belongs to me. I am resurrection. The power of life after death is exclusively mine, okay, is what Jesus is saying. I love this line. Every single funeral that I ever officiate, every single funeral I ever preach, the very first words that I use to comfort those who have come to mourn, grieve, and remember the loss of a loved one is these words here in John chapter 11, verse 25. Okay, now listen. Again, we're going to kind of skip forward to the end of this story, this account of this miracle, this sign. But let me kind of tell you what happens in John chapter 11, verses 28 through 37. Martha leaves the conversation when Jesus goes back to the house, gets her sister Mary, and brings Mary back to Jesus. Mary gets in Jesus' face and says, and I quote verbatim, exactly the same words that Martha used to greet Jesus. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." What do they mean by that? Okay, help me with that. Moreover, verse 33 tells us about some emotions that Jesus is going through. Verse 33 tells us that Jesus is troubled, deeply troubled, or he is deeply moved in his spirit. He's troubled in his spirit. Okay, like mine's ESV. Yours might not be the exact same, but it's going to be a lot like that. In other words, it sounds like Jesus is having this tough moment, like the music is swelling, and there's, all of this focus on the emotion and everything. Okay, the word that John uses in the Greek does not really translate as deeply moved or troubled in spirit. The word that John uses, pardon the Greek lesson here, is embrymaomai. Embrymaomai is a word that means angry, indignant, like ticked off. Okay, in fact, look at your translation. If you have a quality translation, there's going to be like a little number after that phrase in John chapter 11, verse 33, where it says, look down in the footnotes, and it says indignant, mad, angry. So something is happening here that is making Jesus angry, okay? And we'll have to talk more about what that is later. But check this out. Jesus is embrymaomai. He if this was used of an animal, it would be like his nostrils are flaring, like a horse or a bull stamping their feet. Okay, like Jesus is embrymaomai. He's angry about something, it seems. But in verse 35, 2 verses later, the Bible is the shortest verse in the New Testament in English. It says that Jesus wept. The God of the universe loses a tear. Like what? Like drink that in for a moment. Like you put that in a test tube, you break down the DNA in that tear, what do you get? I mean, this is God, creator of the cosmos, crying. Okay, but before we start reading again in John chapter 11, verse 38, listen to what it says in verse 37. The people that are standing around, noticing, from Bethany, from Jerusalem, noticing Jesus look at the tomb, and knowing that there's a dead guy in there that Jesus supposedly loves, they say, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? In other words, man, he healed a man who had been born blind. Surely if he'd have been here, he could have solved this little fever issue, right? Let's conclude the story. John chapter 11, verse 38. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, embrymaomai, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. And Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and his feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Okay, again, Jesus is deeply moved. This embrymaomai. Once more, he's like this swelling anger about what is taking place here. And he speaks to the glory of God. He says, take away the stone. Oh, you don't understand, Jesus. He's been in there for 4 days. There's going to be a stink. Like the King James Version says, Lord, by this point, he stinketh. Okay? And Jesus says, no, listen, sister. Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you see the glory of God? So again, everything that Jesus is doing is about the glory of God. And I love this part, that Jesus takes a moment before he performs the miracle, before he performs the sign, he prays. He leads us by example in exactly what we should do in the middle of tough times. He doesn't complain. He doesn't lose heart. He doesn't abandon the Father. He doesn't blame the Father. He approaches the Father. That's what you and I should do as well in prayer. And then the key is Jesus calls Lazarus out of the womb, out of the tomb by name. I mean, think about this. He says, Lazarus, come out. And the guy who had died comes walking out of the tomb with his hands and his feet bound in linen strips with a cloth over his face, which all this is customary Jewish burial practices. And Jesus says, untie that brother and let him go. Okay? You guys pronounced him dead, but you didn't ask me what I thought. I get the last word. I am the ruler over life and over death. Okay? Again, Jesus raises the dead not by chest compressions, okay? CPR is not going to cut it on a guy who's been dead for 4 days, okay? The sound of the voice of the Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ, speaks and brings life out of a place of death. Okay, is this a sign? Yeah. Okay. It doesn't. Let's go through our rubric. Let's go through our metric that we've been using this entire series. Is it supernatural? Yes. A dead person came back to life. How are you going to explain that except for God? Okay, and Jesus is God. Number two, it's public. We said that signs that should take place in front of witnesses. There should be somebody to go, yeah, I was there. Yeah, I saw it. This is what happened. And so we got Jesus' disciples who are there. Lazarus' family is there. People from Bethany are there. People from Jerusalem have come. So there are lots of witnesses to this miracle. In fact, you know what? I'm not going to tell you what they do with Lazarus. Read another few verses on into John 11 and 12 and see what becomes of Lazarus after he's raised from the dead. I'm not going to tell you. You have to read it. Read into John chapter 12 to see what happens to Lazarus as a result of Jesus raising him from the dead, okay? It gets even more public, and it gets nasty. I'm just going to leave it, tease you with that. There you go. And number three, there are Old Testament prophecies that talk about Messiah raising the dead. Okay, so Isaiah 26:19, when God's people cry out to him, this is what the prophet says: your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. Then there's that passage in Ezekiel chapter 37 where there's the valley of dry bones, and God uses the prophet he uses this valley of dry bones to teach the prophet about the power of the voice of God. And I know that passage is specifically pointing to something else in the future, but I want to draw your attention to it because, again, it's the voice of the spoken voice of God that brings those very dead, dry, old bones in the valley back to life. You can read that about yourself, Ezekiel chapter 37, okay? But all of that to say this: does this miracle mean anything to us? Does this sign actually have anything for us? Lazarus was the one who died and came back to life. Yes, of course it does. Number one, let's go in order. God can raise the dead, okay? Jesus has power over life and death. He's not afraid of tombs, guys. He's not afraid of cemeteries. He's not afraid of morgues. God in Jesus has power over every facet, over every domain of this universe, including after death. You know, go back to the garden. It was God himself who pronounced a curse on man as a consequence of his sin. And right here in Bethany, we see God, in Jesus the Son, liberating man from that consequence by the power of his voice. It's interesting. But don't be surprised. You see, before Jesus raised the dead, before Jesus fed the 5,000, before he walked on the water, okay, before he does any of these miracles, way back in John chapter 5, I didn't call your attention to it weeks ago because I knew we'd get to it in this week's episode. All the way back in John chapter 5, Jesus says this. John 5:25-28. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in their tombs will hear his voice. That moment was this moment, okay? By the way, it's not just the physically dead that Jesus can raise. See, Lazarus was physically dead. No heartbeat, no pulse. He's out. You and I are not. You and I are not physically dead. We are spiritually dead in our sins. I'm filming this video. You're watching this video. But Jesus can actually raise the spiritually dead just as easily as he can raise the physically dead. He speaks and he gives life through his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. Okay, number two, God always hears our prayers. I love this in John chapter 11, verse 41. Jesus takes a moment to thank God for hearing our prayers. Okay, just be glad that that's the kind of God you have. And number three, our God displays emotions. Like, yes, he is embrimaomai, he's angry about something, and I have a theory as to what it is. We can talk about that later. But he also weeps. When his people are broken, he is broken. When his people celebrate, he celebrates. Our God knows our emotions. He had our emotions. Okay, I know there was a lot to cover, and I know we left a lot out. We couldn't get to every detail. So if you have a question about anything in John chapter 11 as it relates to the raising of Lazarus by Jesus, put your question in the comment section below. I'll get back to you as best I can. If it's of a more personal nature, because this is about life and death, you may have experienced something more raw in your life, I invite you to send a private message through our website. Just go to www.theroot.church, click on the contact page, and you can send a private message to me, and I'll give you any help that I can. Now listen, a lot of people call this the last sign in John's gospel. It's the end of the book of signs. And I'm telling you, I don't think it's the last sign. In fact, there's one more sign to go that's going to trump all of these signs put together. It's obviously not the raising of Lazarus, but the resurrection of Jesus himself. So, if you would so entertain me, let's invest one more week into looking at that miracle, at that sign, and the outcome to see all that John has to tell us about Jesus in his gospel. Friends, I hope to see you next week for our very next episode of 30 on Thursdays, where we conclude our series called Signs. Have a great week.